I am Kate Sears-Batowski, Artistic Director of Expo Chicago, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Dialogues, which is in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dialogues offers panel discussions, conversations, and provocative artistic discourse with leading artists, curators, designers, and arts professionals on the current issues that engage them. This afternoon, I'm excited to welcome Amanda, Alteronce, and Jordan for a discussion on the criticality of color. From Williams' inquiries and series, What Black Is This You Say?, to Gumby's continued exploration of light and tonality in the ongoing series, Glass and Gemstones, this conversation investigates the multifaceted role color plays in contemporary art practices. The conversation is moderated by Jordan Carter, curator and co-department head at Dia Art Foundation, who I'm thrilled to welcome back to Chicago. Let's kick it off.
All right.
Thanks, Kate. And hello, Amanda and Alteronce. It's such a pleasure to be in dialogue with you all.
How are you?
This evening, early evening, late afternoon. Well, let's kick it off and maybe start with a little bit of foundation. I'm curious to hear a bit more about, how and when did you both come to color as sort of something that was going to be more than a medium or form, but something you wanted to critically engage, both as subject matter as well?
Age 4. No, I think as for as long as I can remember, like color was always the kind of central component, or I just associated that as art, and so it really then was an evolution of when I was making the transition from kind of full-time architectural practice to an artistic practice to really dive into like what is my motivation? It really was then this deep kind of search for why color, and now in the last maybe 5 years, this kind of interrogation of individual colors or palettes that really is driving that interest.
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Expo, for putting this whole thing together. I think for me, within art, it came later, but I think within life, it happened at a very young age. And it was one of those moments in, preschool or kindergarten when I think the teacher asked everyone to say what's their favorite color and why. And I stood up and said my favorite color was black, and before I could say why, the student behind me said, "Oh, your favorite color is black because you're black." And I was like, "No, it's not. It's because my favorite superhero is Batman, like the Dark Knight." So I was a little confused by that, as like a 5, 6-year-old, because I'm like, my pants are black, but like I'm like a nice, honey umber, and it's like it kind of like messed me up a bit. But it wasn't until I think I went to my first Venice Biennale in 2015, and I saw some beautiful works by these monochromatic Korean painters from the 70s. And it really opened my eyes to maybe the history of monochromatic painting or abstract painting that was kind of, I hadn't learned about before. Here I was in grad school just not hearing about these group of artists. And so kind of doing my research on art history, looking at how other artists have approached this kind of aesthetic of the monochrome, and really trying to find my way or my voice within that. And having that childhood memory, I kind of found myself in Paris looking at the work of Ad Reinhardt or Malevich, and looking at all these kind of white European male painters, and having their own perspective on, say, the color black, of addressing it as maybe as a void or a vacuum or things like that, and me thinking about it as more of like a cultural influence, my heritage, the way I'm identified here in America, and then really trying to, within my own work, move beyond that, move beyond these definitions and terms in which I perceive color.
Thank you so much for those rich responses. Amanda, you were just mentioning a bit your transition, if you will, or sort of from architecture, like into visual arts. And I believe you both have a bit of an architecture background or studied architecture to some degree. So I'm curious to think about sort of the spatial dimensions of color. Both, Amanda, the way in which you've sort of used color as a way of transforming architectural space, such as in your Colored series in the south side of Chicago, using various sort of culturally charged sort of colors that you found to sort of paint these houses that were about to be demolished. And Alteronce, sort of throughout your practice, you're really sort of building up these sort of composite terrains or landscapes using glass and resin and gemstones to sort of take sort of the composition off of, you know, the planar level to sort of something that's really sort of blurring the boundaries per se more between painting and sculpture. So I'm just sort of curious, you know, how you sort of think about color as maybe like a unit or a building block in your practice, something that can sort of take the visual experience more into the three-dimensional, if you will.
I didn't know you studied architecture.
I dropped out my freshman year.
Back.
I didn't finish. I'm sorry. I know you guys.
Even if briefly.
I know, but no,
You have a spatial mind.
I do have a spatial mind, but you know what? It was. I'm happy for architecture because it was my friend. No, I loved architecture, and but I was studying architecture my freshman year, and I'm not the best at math. And so once we started doing the calculations and then building codes and that really killed it for me. and so, but it was during that freshman year of studying architecture that I got to do my first study abroad. And we went to Spain. You know, first 3 days we were in Barcelona. So we did the Gaudi walking tour. Amazing. And then we had time to do, you know, they were like, oh, we have these tickets to go to the Picasso Museum afterwards. And I had no idea who Picasso was. I never stepped foot into an art museum. I was like 19. And so we went to the Picasso Museum, and I was just like blown away. And I remember at the time, I think we were at like Park Güell, and the instructor, who was my architecture instructor, he was like, oh, how's your trip going? And I didn't have the heart to tell him then, like, I'm dropping out. It's a wrap. But I think now I'm really, within my work, I think spatially, I'm really trying to manifest these cosmic landscapes. And so within that, I'm really tapping, you know, deep into my imagination, as most theoretical physicists do when they're trying to conjure the depths of the universe and how to make these formulaic models of how things are perceived. I'm kind of doing that just at a very low risk, low stakes essence, because I'm just in my studio making paintings, but I'm also trying to construct this experience through this synergy of color by using, you know, acrylic paint, glass, gemstones, and resin, which are all kind of giving this very textural and visceral quality. And each of those materials have their own, you know, take on color. They all manifest color differently. Yeah. And so that's what I guess, a part of, maybe I'm going back to architecture, because I'm really kind of constructing these paintings and from a very foreign or alternative mediums.
Yeah, I mean, I made that distinction about like where my source of income was, but like working in a firm and then leaving to make art. But I think the questions about space are always there, and it's always confused me, the same question of like, you're black, and I'm like, well, I'm brown, you know, like which crayon? But I'm always tackling that question about that duality of like a space of blackness and then being black and then the color black. And so I oscillate. They just were kind of cycling. These are the color theory houses, but also the what black is, as you say. It really is a kind of mode of working for me to oscillate between these media, with architecture being a medium in that sense. So there's a foreignness to it, or kind of the medium's performative quality, or like what are its limits, what are its unexpected opportunities. So glass is adding color as light, and then you're adding pigment to that. So there's a layer. When you have a scale of a house, you have to deal with the sun and other elements, like color takes on a different meaning. So in school, of course, we study Albers, we studied modernists, we studied Western kind of tropes. And then I'm trying to sync that with, 79th Street. So there's a way that it takes a while, but that some of that kind of acuity works one way, and then you realize it can also work the other way. So like, how do you leverage both of those? So I feel super fortunate and like spoiled that I can be making projects in real time in both ways. So the Storefront for Art and Architecture project was that. It's never really intentional, but I'm starting with thinking about color in this two-dimensional format, still maybe spatial or like implications of space in 2 dimensions, and then asked immediately you're an architect, just translate it, and then you're talking about the scale of the space and the context of the composition in addition to the object that you're making. So that's interesting to constantly be toggling back and forth, with those components. But I think space is always primary, even if it's a two-dimensional composition. At that micro level, there is some kind of texture coming off the surface, but even beyond that, kind of imagining whatever that is in a larger context.
I'm curious about that process around the storefront commission and thinking about that facade for that sort of architectural extension, if you will, of the What Black Is This You Say series. And I'm curious, it's a question for both of you, which is, do you have any sort of site-specific sort of relationships to color? Because as you were working on that project, I'm imagining you were thinking a lot about those specific coordinates and sort of that particular architecture that you're working with. So I'm just curious with either of you, because I know Alteronce, you work a lot in the landscape, are thinking about certain color light dynamics in certain spaces. Like when you're in the studio or when you're mixing color, are there particular, sets of coordinates or particular landscapes or areas or things or memories of the built environment that sort of inform the ways in which you're thinking about color?
I think for me lately, I'll think about experiences or memories or something that has some kind of geolocation, but really is about kind of connecting back to a moment or kind of a cultural space sometimes. And then now starting to think about the palettes associated with that. So the Candy Lady Black series is like thinking about the Candy Lady, which is a very particular kind of experience, thinking about the whole spatial understanding of like going into a stranger's house and buying candy from their table or whatever. But then of course also the importance of the kitchen or the importance of these like extended mothers in your community, or some of them were in basements, or what did the 70s bungalow style houses look like? So there's a full kind of series that goes on in my mind that associates the colors of that, whether they're specific or like, very tangible, with also the kind of memories of those. So the number of people that are like, oh, green apple, I remember. And then there's a whole kind of series about playing in the street or opening the water hydrant, right? So those colors can be very, very literal, but then they also evoke something much bigger. So I feel like that's starting to be a conscious way of working, of sometimes thinking of a kind of space and a palette versus starting with a palette or a color and then working backwards. It takes longer because you get rabbit holes, about these things. You're like, remember? And then you're like, am I trying to depict something about that particular memory, or am I trying to stick to what I started with now-laters or whatever,
But I totally agree with that, and because I do that too, and I think it adds to the palette. It adds to the tint, at least for me when I'm working on a painting, and maybe it's white or light color. I don't know. I was making this like white kind of like painting the other day, it wasn't really white. It was just like really like light pinks and oranges and greens and stuff like that. But for some reason, it reminded me of, I grew up, in a church. My mother's a pastor. And, sometimes, if anyone's been in a Pentecostal church, the church mothers would sit in the front wearing all white. And for some reason, I was in my studio just having a very kind of like out-of-body experience while I was making this painting. And it reminded me of like hearing and watching my mother like speak tongues and like shout in the church, and because I was kind of like dancing with the painting, and so it kind of added this like extra like texture or sensibility to the painting that I don't think wouldn't have been there if I hadn't had that experience, you know? And so it kind of goes both ways as well. Like even when I'm exhibiting work, like the work that's on the screen now, this is at my show, Dark Matter at Alteronce Art Museum, where I specifically made a series of paintings that you saw them in two different light sources. So you saw them in regular incandescent light, and then you also saw them under UV light. And the paintings within themselves, kind of the color shifted, the experience shifted from maybe one palette to the next, but it was still kind of the same painting. And I think I was really trying to expand my own sensibility and awareness of the different phases and sources in which color could exist out in the world. You know, our relationship to the way we see color is completely, you know, celestial. It's based on one star, you know, the sun that we have. So we're all born on this planet Earth, and all of our eyes or cones are adjusted to see color and light as it relates to the sun. And so I'm always trying to think of new ways to see color and maybe different experiences of light, different degrees. Maybe if I go into my mind's eye and I try to imagine myself on a distant planet in another solar system with another star, and what colors would I see? You know, the rainbow would be completely different. Would the sky be blue or orange or purple? You know, I don't know. So I'm trying to bring that kind of imaginary space into my work as well.
That's beautiful.
That's really powerful what you just brought up in terms of, you know, the limited range of our sort of chromatic perception, if you will, which sort of, you know, raises for me sort of a larger sense of the politics of color in relationship to, you know, the ways in which, you know, the politics of perception, the ways in which we see and sort of the connotations, therefore, that we bring to color. And in that regard, I'm curious if you could talk about how you sort of position your work in terms of, say, a politics of color, whether it be thinking through your color choices as a political act or sort of an aspiration for your work through sort of its chromatic engagement to have sort of a potential sort of social, cultural, political sort of effect, if you will.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think being Black is political. Like we don't have any choice. Right. Thank you, Eileen. Right. So on the one hand, it's like everything we do, there's a politics, but then I think there's also like a difference between. So, you know, this kind of project that's a provocation, you know, in a neighborhood that's very different than the ones I was imagining when I was making these captions, that's a different kind of conversation than, say, Faith Ringgold was trying to have, or these other artists that are overtly trying to, you know, kind of establish positions and also, like, trying to be alive. So I feel like there's a relative privilege that our generation is enjoying, where we're still making work about Blackness, but there's a full range of having an understanding of which ways we're going to kind of engage these politics, whether they're directly through the work sometimes or other advocacy that we're doing. But, you know, praying over your pork chops on Kidmere in Soho, you know, there's a certain kind of confrontation that happens with that. And it's this project in particular, for those of you that are not familiar with it or have not been to New York, Storefront for Art and Architecture is historically a place that's trying to bring provocations around issues of space and equity and power. And they approached me during the pandemic to make their storefront Black. And so we had a very long conversation, including the board, about what does this mean. So a good friend of mine, Andres Hernandez, you know, challenged them. He's like, once you go Black, you never go back. So now the project is over, and it's still there, and there's no graffiti. And so which I'm shocked by. I mean, occasionally there is, right? But in general, there's a kind of reverence for this that you have to assume is because of what it's saying, because it's the same colors. You and I use the same colors, but there's a different way that, in that context and what the expectation of what that place is and what this adds to, you know, at the time, a kind of, you know, Starchitect and Stephen Hall, who's kind of refashioning this with Vito Acconci, to add this or to apply Blackness but not blackface. Like, there's all these layers of complexity that go on with that. That is a kind of politics that I wasn't necessarily sitting down saying, I'm going to challenge Western conventions of space, you know. But like this is what it's doing, and so it was actually terrifying in that way when they came, because what if people were graffitiing, or what if they're like adding words, or so I usually don't do things that kind of have that messaging quality, one to one. And even though these are funny quips or they're very, you know, kind of nuanced ways that we're talking about blackness, you know, there is, to my mind, probably the most overtly provocative kind of conversations being had that, you know, we see in spaces like the internet where there's an anonymity where people can get away with doing things, where when it's brought to full space, there's a different kind of, you know, confrontation that's happening.
Yeah, no. I feel like it's interesting because we as human beings have radicalized color. You know, I think in nature, color is just what it is. It's an absorption and a reflection of light. And so we as human beings, us being the intellectual beings that we are, have, you know, taken color and have given it these signs, signifiers, these definitions, these themes, these moods, these emotions. You know, we've turned them into homonyms. And so I think within art, that has also been reinforced and exposed, you know, going back to, you know, Paul Billowed and, you know, Negroes fighting in a tunnel at night, carried out through Malevich, and even, you know, moving into, you know, pop culture, or even, I feel like when Martin Luther King Jr. was, you know, saying, you know, I'm black and I'm proud, I'm black, you know, I'm black and I'm beautiful, I feel like he was talking to Malevich and Paul Billowed, because I felt like these color codes have been embedded in European society, translated into American society and rigor in terms of, like, you know, segregation and Jim Crow laws. And now I feel like as a black man in America living in, you know, as a millennial making art, I feel like in some ways I'm carrying all of these things, especially when I'm, you know, making these colored or, you know, monochromatic paintings, that when I'm in my studio working on the paintings, I try to move through all that, you know what I mean? I'm just trying to exist as a human being in this world and not necessarily always have to make a political statement within each painting I'm making, you know? I paint as a passion, you know? And so that's my pleasure. That's my safe space for me is in my studio. So I try to leave all the BS, you know what I mean, that's going on in the world outside of the doors. And so I think that's probably why I probably lean more towards, you know, a little bit more of Afrofuturism and think about Sun Ra and, you know, space is the place. Because I'm like, you know, if I were to go to, you know, say I was in Star Wars and I pulled up on, you know, Tatooine in a cafe, and, you know what I mean, I'm like, oh, you know, back where I'm from, they say I'm black. And they're like, what's that? And I'm like, it's a color. It's like, you know, it's like my pants. And they're like, you look nothing like your pants, sir. And I'd be like, well, you know, my name's Alteronce. They're like, okay, you could have just said that. And so, you know what I mean? So I'm like, well, that's where my identity starts, you know what I mean? And so I feel like only here on this planet do these, you know, terms or identity politics or whatever really matter. You know, once we leave the atmosphere, none of that really matters, you know. And so I like these microaggressions that we have here on Earth around race, identity, and color are really just Earth problems. You know, they mean nothing to the laws of the universe. And so I try to, you know, more lean towards that.
I mean, I'm gonna jump in and then you can keep us moving because we'll go to outer space. But I mean, I love that I'm addicted. Like, I'll be doing color the rest of my life. So, spoiler alert. But I like that I can oscillate in between being obsessed with it, kind of like working through issues or complexity of blackness, or when I get to transcend an identity, or all these kinds of things. But then no, both of us, and this is a great slide to jump on, like both of us then get at these hyper-technical kind of passions about the material and the pigment. And so I think it's nice to know that basically this same rainbow offers us like infinite ways to either be completely lost and divorced from having to make these associations. And then also, it like saved my life in COVID to be making these riffs on blackness. And then the number of people that were like, what's today's black? Like they were waiting, you know? And so then there was like also this closeness that you were having, this kind of call and response and these answers. That was like, I could have never imagined that before that moment. And so I like, again, this kind of privilege of being able to like, in a totality of a career, there'll be things that are overtly trying to grasp at things, and others that'll be like, I just like blue. You know, like this has a lot of politics with it, but literally, you know, like showing this picture to people like it's my child. You know, it's like, guess what? Today. So there's at least 30 people in this audience getting like texts at 5 a.m. like, look, blue. And they're like, oh, okay, yes. You are doing it. You know, I'm like, it's blue. They're like, yeah. I'm like, I made it. They're like, yes, it's blue. You made it. Okay. But that's great. You know, that kind of liberatory joy that we can have and that can be infectious. So, you know, maybe for other artists, it's a geometry or it's a kind of mark. So it's not unique to color, but I just feel like I'm glad that I found my thing. I'm never going to get bored with that, you know? And I can be free or I can kind of put on a cape when necessary, you know, related to this thing as that vehicle for that.
It's good therapy.
Yes.
And I think it's good to like as an artist that we have that we can engage in a conversation with color and through color and go beyond it to take it to another space. It's not like we're holding on to something. We're like touch and go with the ideas in it, and hopefully through art, you know, the idea transcends its, you know, this otherness.
Yeah.
You guys brought up so much. I'm like, where to go next? I was like, ooh, how am I gonna like link that to my next question? So expansive. Well, Alteronce, you brought up something which is, you know, the sort of precarious origins of the monochrome, or sort of this hidden inscription, Negroes battling in a cave, that was not so long ago discovered via X-ray on Malevich's 1950, I believe it is, Black Square, which just made me think a little bit about the intersections between color and language, and how that's playing out, sort of like inscription or annotation within your practices, because the titles are actually quite poetic in both cases. You know, I'm seeing the religion with no name, for instance, on the screen here with you, Alteronce, and you know, Amanda, you were talking about sort of the provocation of what black is this you say, and sort of using language to sort of implicate the viewer in sort of this determination of color. But even within that, you're like, in each of these variations of blackness that you're engaging, you have sometimes quite long sort of narrative titles that are really kind of like on par with the work itself, you know, sort of seems like that linguistic element is sort of a conceptual dimension of the work's construction. So I was curious if you all could talk about, you know, how you sort of begin to think about your titles, or how you begin to think about language in relationship to color, and sort of maybe how a color even can function as a score for that sort of thinking.
Go.
Yeah, I like titles. I like wordplay, and you know, I grew up listening to hip hop. I as a teenager, I wrote poetry. I wrote songs, and so I've always enjoyed you know, wordplay within my work, and I feel like within the titling of my paintings, I just wanted to make sure that I was taking advantage of that space to add another layer of context or dimensionality or thought process to the work, so that I didn't just leave it, you know, as an untitled painting. You know, I wanted to name my kids in a way. And so certain titles I have been a little provocative, I'd say, especially early on. There was some one painting I made that was titled My President's Black, but my painting's still blue. And that was a series. That was a run-on title for a while. I think the last one was My President's Orange, but my painting's still blue. And but it's a color play. And, but yeah, I think for me it's just, you know, because the paintings are so visual, I'm someone as an artist who just loves to read the titles as well. I feel like it adds a footnote to see what the artist was thinking. Sometimes I'll title my paintings after songs I'm listening to at the time, or something precarious that someone says when I'm out in public, and I'm like, that was a good phrase. But you know, I'll use that to describe a painting because I feel like it adds to some layer of not figuration, but kind of representation to the painting. Because you know, I make abstract works, so if I was just going around saying that this is, you know, orange, blue, 24, I could have done that. Some artists do that, but for me, I feel like it's such a missed opportunity to maybe activate one's imagination even more.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was gonna blame and/or credit hip hop also with. We just started, you know, I'm Gen X, I'm not millennial, but hip hop 1.0, as we call it in my house. But you know, there's like a way that it was like a necessity for understanding a kind of communication. But I think it also sometimes becomes a crutch. Maybe that's too strong of a word, but it's like sometimes the titles outdo the pieces in my mind. Not that the works aren't strong, but then there's a discomfort for me when the work's not doing enough for the title. So sometimes I'll pause it, or I'll, you know, like they have to do each other justice. And sometimes I feel like the title helps make you love the painting a little too much sometimes. Like it needs to kind of stand on its own. And I had this public work, again, was monochrome. So that was also interesting to switch from these quick Instagram images that did have a lot of texture and composition and strength to then something, you know, that we're making these like nonsensical associations, because it really was like, is it my skin? Is it the light? Is that black? Can you see in there? Like, and then what does that mean about pork chops? Like, so trying to force these correlations that weren't there, and then instantly switching back to the architecture mind and like could reduce that complexity down to individual colors with no concern. So there was a strangeness to me about that. That was like, are the titles doing too much? Could the work be doing more? These sorts of things. But I think constantly, because of this kind of generation where image was associated, when MTV really showed music videos, like that era of like the first time you're hearing sound, image, word all at the same time, and that's supposed to be okay. And now we've moved into this next generation of like creating it as you're hearing it, making it. So like the device is doing like a fourth dimension of work that we take for granted, these kinds of multi sources. And then you're going back one to like then starting to look at artists that use graphic or words, image as text, as form, as, you know, so I feel like there's still that kind of untapped ability to maybe examine that as a way to understand what comes naturally in this kind of form of our urban poetry or our generational poetry through hip hop.
Thank you for that. And in terms of, you know, history, I'm curious to sort of, you know, take a retrospective gaze for a moment. And, you know, one of your titles, Alteronce, actually, you know, there's an homage to Sam Gilliam, which has me thinking a little bit about, you know, who are some of the artistic forebearers that you all do think about when you're in the studio, thinking about color or otherwise. I know, Alteronce, you know, you've evoked sort of histories of light and space artists, and we've been talking a lot about the monochrome generally throughout this conversation. So I'm just curious, maybe you all could give us some art historical indexes in terms of, you know, how you're charting your path in that way.
I mean, even though I don't think you would never look at any of these works and make the correlations, but I think Jacob Lawrence was probably the first, like hugely influential. I was able to spend a lot of time with Raymond Saunders when I lived out in the Bay Area. Coming from Chicago, obviously Afrocobra and the work that they did and still do, and the kind of like that oscillation with the politics, but also the levity and just having the gumption to do it at a time when that wasn't popular. And their movement between materiality constantly, like that's an endless encyclopedia right there. So those folks kind of historically, and then in present day, obviously, somebody like a Kerry James Marshall has been hugely influential for me. But nothing that you could make a one-to-one, I don't think, correlation between, and more either understanding of a process or trying to deconstruct how they come to color, because it's so clear in so many of those practices. What is that meant for what they thought it should do, and then what they were expressing, and then kind of vice versa. That's super helpful to kind of just figure out, like, then what does that mean for me? And also this kind of not rebuke, but like also not giving so much weight to the kind of modernist sensibility, which was so integral to the formal training, but to honor this kind of other, things that were obviously very present, but weren't, they weren't in the classroom, in the books, and so forth.
Who am I looking at in terms of color? I guess, of course, I look at a lot of artists. Monet is definitely someone I go to a lot for a palette. Stanley Whitney, yes, Sam Gilliam. But I also, I've been looking a lot outside of art for inspiration of color as well. I've been looking at, NASA's images of the James Webb Telescope, of the Hubble Telescope, of these nebulas and, celestial spaces that are just out there in the universe. I also am really looking at a lot of like film. So I mean, Hype Williams, to me, his music videos from like the 2000s was like one of my first, I feel like, color study courses. Wes Anderson movies. I don't know who his colorist is, but they're amazing. And actually, I've been traveling a lot, also looking at color. So the past year, I've been working on a documentary called Color, and I've pretty much have been looking at color from cultural and natural standpoint. So, going to New Orleans, to Mardi Gras, looking at the floats, going to Holi celebration in India, looking at color underwater, just going scuba diving in the Great Barrier Reef, going to Alaska to look at the Northern Lights. And that's really, being, I guess, kind of a city boy and, living in New York for, was 18 years now. I feel like I've had a little bit of a detach from nature, a little bit from, living in a concrete jungle. So I think going out and traveling to these places and really just getting in touch with nature has brought back a different sensibility of color for me, especially because that's one of the first places where we start to recognize color, and especially from pigment stance, color comes from nature. It was the chemists and the scientists and the paint makers and, these ancient civilizations that started going out, find these different plants and minerals, grinding them up and turning those into pigments. And that's where we have, our golden palette today. But it all started with nature.
So in terms of sort of sidestepping art history proper in some of your color investigations, or many of your color investigations, I'm curious, to dive a little bit deeper into sort of this intersection of color and material history more broadly. And Amanda, we've been looking at this blue vial that's been sort of rotating on the screen. And if I understand correctly, this is a patented pigment by none other than George Washington Carver of an Egyptian blue that you've sort of been homing in on. So I was curious if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that process, and maybe even in doing so, and maybe this is a way for Alteronce you to sort of respond as well, sort of thinking about, I think it's interesting to think about color as something that could be like a patented pigment, thinking about color in terms of ingenuity, in terms of like, material history, but in this instance, like, Black history of like innovation and invention. And then thinking a little bit about, what is, the material, like this idea of materiality of color. And then thinking about, how that then intersects with, cultural context, and Alteronce, what then sort of provoked you, or like what sort of stirs you to want to sort of understand color beyond, outside of just sort of your cultural context, and taking you on all of these travels that are informing your documentary.
Yeah, I think that it started a little bit what you were talking about with this kind of like weight that we carry about these associations, especially with Blackness, about the way that blackness has to operate and color has to operate within that. And so color theory was so strong because it was calling attention to these injustices that people maybe understood in a way that seeing them in a kind of spatial context kind of exploded the way people might understand or see possibility in that. And so to then go back and say, well, no, you have this person in the early 1900s who's just like great at everything. And it was like, his 15th thing was like, I guess we can patent the color. I did do that, but peanuts, sweet potatoes. He's like crocheting, dancing, like all this stuff this man is doing. But for me, it was that the patent that led me kind of backwards. So we actually worked on 2 different blues. So there's the Egyptian blue, which Terry Atkins did quite a bit of work with. And it kind of had amazing shows that were going deep into that kind of connection that is cultural, but was very much about that materiality. And then the one he patented, actually the one that you're seeing, is for a Prussian blue. And it had to do with the high iron content in the red clay dirt or the soil that's so ubiquitous in that part of Alabama, right around Tuskegee and Montgomery. So I actually just went 2 weeks ago to the archive, and it's like mind-blowing to walk. First of all, it feels like you're walking back, like 1952. It's like, is this the same country? Where are we? Like, like you feel like you're going back in time, but when you think about the number of things that they were pioneering and doing from nothing to do all this greatness, and then the resources we have, like, not only do we pull that story forth, but just this idea of like not letting people land on anything, like it's so mind-boggling, that no one questions Yves Klein. He's just sitting around, is like, I'm finna be known for blue. We're gonna go down in history, and when you say blue, somebody say Yves Klein, right? And this is what happens, right? I told somebody working on blue, they're like, Yves Klein, like George Washington Carver. So like, how do we disrupt the narratives in that way? But then how can we just geek out on pigment? Like I think I told you, and I was like, and then it's like this much, and then you can add, and then I'm gonna do this. So I think there's a way that there's a liberation with that, where that color is then gonna demand a kind of joy and not a kind of weight of its being in that same sort of way. And so for me to be able to really now think about like what does that translate into in terms of the mark that gets made or to the works that are going to be made, that's very powerful because you using gems or something that's actually literally not paint, and this is pigment, it's not yet paint, so it could be compressed, it could be mixed with Maria Pinto's here, it could be dyes, it could be, like there could be so many other things that can happen with this. Why would it want to be painting? Or if we're already in abstraction and we're not limited to trying to tell the whole history of George Washington Carver, like then what else does it want to be? So there's a kind of paralysis with that too, but there's this kind of like limitlessness that the recreation of the pigment and being in a mind of ingenuity has given, as opposed to going to Blick and buying the Prussian blue, which I could have also done, right, and had this kind of whole thesis on blue. So there's something exciting about the labor of that, and I think about it all the time in your work with like these gemstones, because there's a complexity too of like understanding that light, and then when is the choice to like add then medium on top of that, because that's a little bit, it's not the same, but it's definitely that moment of like, does it just want to stay pigment? And then you're like, ooh, and soil, and ooh, and so and so, right? So then you really are getting into every level of material of a kind of producing an object.
Yeah, and I think within my work, with the gemstones, it's really just thinking about the history of where pigment comes from, right? Because I've used, it started with lapis lazuli and red jasper, and these are all minerals that can be grounded up and actually turned into pigments. But then for me, it also goes the other way, where I'm thinking about, the history of this planet and how long it took for this gemstone to actually brew in the Earth's crust, and the chemical reactions it went through, and minerals that had to come together in this specific spot in a titanic place that had to shift, and all these things to make this gemstone manifest itself and the history that it carries. It's been around longer than human civilization, probably. And so that, but then also it's like, these gemstones also have frequencies, or they have energy, just as we all, as human beings, give off energy and frequencies. And I found out that the color of the gemstone is actually attuned to the frequency that it gives off. So when you're looking at a blue painting of mine, you know, you're experiencing the painting, you know, visually, and maybe conceptually, because it's abstract paint and it's art, but then also energetically, because these gemstones are just giving off, you know, these frequencies. And so all of that kind of brought things together for me. There are many different ways in which you can experience a work of art, but also experience color. And that just added another layer to that for me. But I think you're asking me, why do I like to go outside? Or like,
No, I think it was more. No.
what did he say? He was just,
That's part of it. But no, I was just thinking, I was thinking a little bit about, color and cultural specificity in terms of thinking about, this George Washington Carver blue and the specific sort of instance of Black innovation that it sort of indexes in relationship to what you were just talking about around this more global investigation of how color is operating in your travels in terms of Holi and India and, Mardi Gras and the Northern Lights, sort of how you're sort of looking to find like new ways of understanding color through your engagement with cultures that are not your own.
Yeah, I'm a very curious person, and I kind of deem myself like an artist explorer. And so I like to travel. Every time I travel, I try to hit up at least 1 or 2 museums and check out some space or place that I probably shouldn't be, just to see what's going on over there, And so over the past few years, I've actually been experimenting. I guess throughout my whole artistic practice, I've always kind of taken a sidestep into work with mediums outside of painting, whether it be ceramics or natural pigment dye workshops or glass workshops or things like that. And so I think that for me, that's just, I'm trying to see outside of just painting or traditional art or anything that you'll probably see on the walls here in this art fair. Like, there's other art forms out there. There's other forms of expression out there, and I'm trying to just tap into all of them. And I think that just leads me down a couple of deep rabbit holes that then eventually I bring back and that experience into the studio. And so it's just really a passion of mine. I'm just following my passion and what I believe to be my purpose in life is to be an investigator of color.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your passion of color. It's certainly been a colorful conversation. I couldn't help myself. So with that, we're going to open it up to questions. Thank you.